Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Palermo. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1864, and Palermo was still recovering from the turbulence of the Italian unification. The echoes of Garibaldi's campaign had faded, yet the air remained thick with suspicion and superstition. In that uneasy silence, a small ridge above the city, Col della Crime, or Sorrow's Hill, became the setting of a story that would haunt Sicily's ecclesiastical archives for decades. The hill rose above the outskirts of the city, overlooking the distant Tyrrhenian Sea and the ancient rooftops of the Calza district. Its slopes were overgrown with olive trees and dry grass, and locals often said that at dusk the wind there carried the faint sound of sobbing. Few ventured to climb it after dark. The place had a reputation, long before the sisters arrived. Atop that hill stood the convent of Our Lady of Sorrows, a pale limestone building surrounded by crumbling walls. The convent was small, home to only a handful of women who had chosen isolation over the noise of the city. They belonged to a minor order recently established under diocesan authority, a contemplative community devoted to the Virgin's compassion for the suffering. According to the history of Palermo, the mid-19th century was a time when several noble families withdrew their endowments from monasteries following the secular reforms of the new Kingdom of Italy. Many small convents were forced to relocate or close. The Sisters of Our Lady of Sorrows were one of those displaced communities, sent from Palermo's heart to this forgotten hill, where faith and solitude blurred into something else entirely. The convent had been a private villa before being converted into a religious house. Its first owner, Signora Isabella Caruso, came from a once prominent family of landowners who had prospered under Bourbon rule. After the death of her husband, she retreated to this property in 1849 and built a private chapel within it. There she installed a life-sized statue of the Madonna Addolorata, Our Lady of Sorrows, carved from Neapolitan marble. The villagers later said the statue's eyes seemed too human, its expression too vivid. They whispered that the sculptor had used real tears as varnish. No record confirms that, yet the rumor survived well into the following century. When Isabella Caruso died in 1859, she left the property to the church for the purpose of sheltering women devoted to the silent service of Our Lady. 4 years later, in the summer of 1863, 3 nuns arrived to fulfill that wish: Sister Maria Teresa, Sister Lucia, and the novice Sister Benedetta. They took their vows in Palermo and settled quietly on Sorrow's Hill, carrying little more than their prayer books and the last of their convent's relics. For the first year, little was heard from them. They grew olives, taught local children to read, and attended Mass in the nearby parish of San Girolamo. The people of Palermo spoke of them with mild curiosity, calling them Lipai Lacrimos, the weeping pious ones, for their solemn faces and dark robes. But by autumn of 1864, something began to stir on the hill that drew both fascination and fear. It started, as such things often do, with a small observation. Father Angelo Mancuso, a parish priest assigned to oversee the convent's confessions, noted in his diary on September 17, 1864, "When I entered the chapel, I saw moisture upon the marble face of the Virgin. It glistened in the lamplight. The sisters said the air had been dry all week. The tears may be condensation, or they may be something else." Father Mancuso's note is the first official record of what came to be called the Weeping Madonna of Sorrow's Hill. In the months that followed, word spread quietly through Palermo that the statue of the Virgin was shedding tears each morning. Pilgrims began climbing the ridge to see it. Some claimed the drops were salty like human tears. Others said they vanished when touched. The diocesan authorities dismissed the reports as exaggerations of pious minds. Yet the entries in the convent ledger tell a different story. Between October 1 and November 15 of that year, the sisters recorded 15 separate instances of visible tears upon the image of Our Lady, sometimes accompanied by what they described as a fragrance of myrrh and olive. The convent's servant, Rosina Giuffrida, later testified that she had seen the statue's eyes darken as though filled with sorrow. Her statement, preserved in the municipal archives of Palermo, was dismissed for lack of evidence. Still, the phenomenon drew attention. Even members of the local constabulary climbed the hill to see for themselves. By late November, the sisters began to complain of exhaustion and sleeplessness. One of them, Sister Lucia, confided in Father Mancuso that she had been waking each night to the sound of footsteps in the chapel. At first, she wrote, "I thought it was Benedetta praying. But when I entered, the place was empty, and the statue's face glistened with dew as if she had been weeping again." Thus began the first chapter of the Sorrows Hill case, a mystery that, in time, would unravel the convent's peace, test the church's patience, and leave behind a trail of silence no historian could fully explain. By the beginning of December 1864, the people of Palermo were whispering about Sorrows Hill. The road that wound toward the convent grew busier with the curious, dock workers, widows, even soldiers on leave, all climbing to see what they called La Virgen Chipienge, the Weeping Virgin. The sisters, frightened by the attention, barred the gates. They asked that no visitors approach after sundown, though some continued to creep through the olive grove by lantern light. In one of his later entries, Father Mancuso wrote, "They pray more now, but not in peace. Their eyes are hollow, and the walls of that place drink their sighs." The city's Jornal di Palermo printed a small column on December 8th. No names, only reference to a pious house wherein a marble virgin sheds visible tears. Authorities from the diocesan curia dismissed the article as rumor, yet the phenomenon persisted. Each morning, Sister Maria Teresa recorded the same drops upon the cheeks, renewed by dawn. The convent ledger for that winter is still held in the diocesan archive. Its pages are streaked with damp, the ink blurred, as if the very records had absorbed the hill's sorrow. Between the entries of tithers and oil purchases, there appear phrases that read more like pleas than accounts. "Forgive us our doubt. The image watches while we sleep." Locals began to connect the events on Sorrows Hill with older legends. Some said the ridge had once been a burial ground during the 1837 cholera epidemic, a time clearly chronicled in the history of Palermo, when hundreds were buried in shallow graves beyond the city walls. The proximity of that ground fed the suspicion that the convent had been built upon unconsecrated soil. Others murmured that Signora Isabella Caruso, the villa's former owner, had not died naturally. The midwife who attended her final hours was said to have heard her cry out that, "The Virgin weeps for what I have done." What she meant by that was never recorded. As Advent approached, Sister Benedetta's behavior changed. Once the most cheerful of the three, she grew withdrawn. She stopped eating bread, claiming that it tasted of ashes. On the night of December 21, the convent's servant Rosina heard the chapel door creak open and saw Benedetta walking barefoot across the corridor, her candle unlit. Rosina followed at a distance and swore she heard two voices inside the chapel, one whispering, one weeping. When she entered, the room was empty. Benedetta's candle lay on the floor, melted almost to the wick. At dawn, the novice was missing. The sisters searched the grounds, but found only her rosary beside the old olive tree at the eastern edge of the property. Its beads were damp though the morning was dry. A report was filed with the Commissario Civico of Palermo, who sent a single constable up the hill. His name was Antonio Benedetto, a coincidence that unsettled the nuns further. In his statement, still preserved in the municipal register, he wrote, "The soil was loose near the roots, as if freshly turned. I marked the place, but found no trace of the missing woman. The sisters spoke little and looked beyond me, as if hearing something behind the wind." 3 days later, on Christmas Eve, Sister Benedetta returned. She appeared at the chapel door during evening prayers, her garments torn, her hands black with earth. When Father Mancuso questioned her, she could give no account of where she had been. She only repeated, "She asked us to weep for her sins." The priest recorded that her pupils were dilated and her pulse slow, as though she had wandered half in sleep, half in prayer. From that night onward, the statue's tears thickened. Witnesses described them as milky rather than clear. The diocesan office ordered a formal inquiry. A committee of 3 clerics and a physician ascended Sorrow's Hill on January 6, 1865. Their inspection notes survive in fragment. Statue composed of marble, sealed and hollow. Moisture upon cheeks measurable by linen cloth. Possible condensation due to humidity, though source uncertain. The report was inconclusive, but one observation stood apart, that the marble around the eyes felt warm to the touch. The physician, Dr. Giuseppe Lopresti, refused to sign the final page, stating privately to a colleague that the image appears to breathe. His letter of resignation from the commission was filed a week later. After the committee's visit, the sisters withdrew almost entirely from contact with the city. Their gates remained closed, their correspondence ceased. Only Father Mancuso was allowed entry once a month. In his February journal he wrote, "The youngest sister trembles at prayer. The elder watches the statue, as though awaiting a signal. I fear their solitude has deepened into something unholy." He asked the curia to transfer them back to Palermo, but by the time permission came, the convent had fallen silent. No letters, no alms, no messenger willing to climb that hill. Those who passed along the lower road claimed to see candlelight flicker in the windows long after midnight, and to hear chanting, low, rhythmic, and not in Latin. By early spring 1865, Palermo's newspapers had grown tired of the story. Yet among the fishermen of the harbor and the merchants of the Bala market, the whispers continued that the Madonna still wept, that one of the nuns had broken her vow, and that the hill itself would not rest until the truth was confessed. The year 1865 dawned bleak and windless over Palermo. From the harbor one could see Sorrow's Hill wrapped in mist, its olive trees barely visible through the haze. The convent bell, once rung each morning for prayer, fell silent after Epiphany. According to Father Mancuso's remaining notes, the sisters claimed the bell rope had frayed and snapped, but when he examined it, he found it cleanly cut. As if by a sharp blade, he wrote, rumors began to stir again in the lower quarters of the city. Some said the sisters had gone mad, others that they were concealing a miracle the church wished to suppress. A merchant named Paolo di Rosa, who supplied them with olive oil and candles, testified that he was refused entry when he came to deliver provisions. He heard movement inside, but no one answered. It was like knocking at a tomb. He told the constabulary. By February, the convent's financial records ceased. The diocesan treasurer later discovered that the sisters had not cashed their stipends for 2 months. The servants had left, one after another, claiming illness or dread that followed them into sleep. Only Rosina Giuffrida remained, the maid who had served since the Caruso family's time. In her later deposition, she described nights filled with whispers coming from beneath the chapel floor and a fragrance like blood and roses. On the evening of February 11, 1865, Rosina fled the convent barefoot, reaching the nearest farmhouse at dawn. Her statement survives in the parish archive. I heard them singing, but not in Latin. I saw their candles circle the statue, and the youngest among them wept not for sorrow but for joy. Then the floor opened. I heard it, I swear, and something below answered their hymn. Her testimony was dismissed as hysteria. Yet the following day, Father Mancuso was summoned once more. He found the convent door unlatched and the chapel cold, though candles had burned recently. The statue of the Madonna stood unchanged, except for a faint crimson streak along the base, which he first mistook for candle wax. When he touched it, it stained his sleeve. He returned a week later with another priest, Father Sebastiano Greco, a younger man trained in the seminary of Monreale. Greco's account, written in a letter to the diocesan vicar, adds new detail. The elder sister, Maria Teresa, received us in the courtyard. Her eyes were ringed with black, and she held her hands hidden beneath her sleeves. I asked after Sister Benedetta. She said the novice had taken ill and was confined to her cell. When we requested to see her, she refused, saying the girl was under the Madonna's instruction. Greco's letter continues with unease. He describes hearing a rhythmic tapping from beneath the chapel tiles as they recited the Ave Maria. Each knock followed our words, as if answering. When he looked toward the statue, he thought the eyes seemed darker, as though something moved behind the marble. That night, Father Mancuso pressed the sisters to let him take Benedetta to the infirmary in Palermo. They agreed to bring her out by morning. But at dawn, the cell stood empty once again. The window was open, the blanket soaked as if by rain, though the night had been dry. Mancuso descended the hill to inform the authorities, but when the constables returned with him, the sisters were gone. Doors stood ajar, rosaries scattered on the floor. On the altar lay a single page torn from a devotional book. Written across it, in an unsteady hand, "She forgave us, but only after we wept as she did." No trace of the nuns was ever found. For a brief time, the church sealed the property. Guards were posted at the entrance to prevent further trespass. Yet curiosity prevailed. Shepherds from nearby villages claimed that each dawn, a bell rang faintly from the empty chapel, the same bell whose rope had been severed. Others said that smoke rose from the chimney, though no one had relit the hearth. In the weeks following the disappearance, local physician Dr. Giuseppe Lopresti, who had been part of the earlier inquiry, was asked to assist in cataloging the convent's remaining items. His report lists household objects, correspondence, and several journals belonging to the sisters. The final entry, written in Sister Lucia's hand, is dated March 4, 1865. "We have done as she asked. The tears are our penance. When they cease, we shall be free." Lopresti added a private note. The handwriting trembles yet ends with serenity, as if the writer foresaw her own death. Within a month, Sorrow's Hill was abandoned. The church debated whether to demolish the site or reconsecrate it. In the end, they chose silence. The keys were kept in the diocesan vault, and no mass was held there again. But the silence did not hold. During the summer of 1866, when Palermo suffered another outbreak of fever, peasants camping near the ridge claimed to see lights flickering within the ruined convent. A shepherd boy found footprints in the dust of the chapel floor, 3 distinct sets ending abruptly before the altar. And once again, the statue's marble face bore droplets along its cheeks, though no one could say how long they had been there. By then, the city's attention had moved to political unrest and cholera prevention. Yet among the few who remembered, the name Sorrow's Hill no longer referred to a place, but to a haunting, a lingering wound in the faith of a city that had already seen too much suffering. It was shortly after the harvest moon of 1864 when the first sound pierced the nightly silence of Sorrow's Hill, a cry, not of a child, nor beast, but something that unsettled even the faithful. The locals said it began as a sobbing sound from the chapel of the Madonna, the one built by the Sisters of Our Lady of the Cross, halfway between the olive groves and the monastery gardens. The nuns had always guarded that place with a peculiar devotion. According to the records from the parish of San Domenico, the statue of the Madonna was a gift from a Spanish sculptor who had once taken refuge in Palermo after a shipwreck. He carved her face in the image of his lost wife. The statue was said to weep whenever sin entered the convent walls. At least, that was the tale whispered among the novices. That night, Sister Agata was the first to hear it. She was a gentle soul, a widow who had entered the order after the death of her son during the cholera epidemic. While scrubbing the chapel floors, she claimed to have heard a soft whimper, like a mother calling out to a distant child. She froze, cloth still in hand, heart hammering. The sound came from the statue's direction. When she looked up, the candle flames trembled though there was no wind, and there it was, a faint glisten at the Virgin's eyes. She blinked, rubbed her own, thinking fatigue had deceived her. But the next morning, as the early light filtered through the stained glass, she saw the same thing again, thin trails of moisture running down the marble cheeks. The Mother Superior, Suor Benedetta, dismissed the claim. "Stone cannot cry," she said. "It is the imagination of the weary." But Sister Agata insisted, and by the third night, others began to hear it too, soft sobbing echoing faintly across the cloisters, like the sound of a woman grieving in prayer. One evening, a small procession of sisters gathered with candles and hymns, determined to confront the mystery. They sang the Salve Regina, their voices trembling as the sound seemed to answer, a faint moan resonating behind the altar. And then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing behind the sealed sacristy door. When they opened it, the air was ice cold. A single rosary lay broken on the floor. From that night onward, the peace of the convent was broken. Sleep became scarce. The novices murmured prayers in the corridors, and the elders began to speak of a spirit bound to the statue, perhaps the soul of a woman who had once taken the veil unwillingly. A few miles away, Father Cesare Lemo, the parish historian, recorded in his diary, "The Sisters of Sorrow's Hill speak of lamentations at night. They believe the Virgin grieves for their hidden sins. I fear the sins may belong not to marble, but to flesh." Indeed, Palermo was a city of contradictions in that year. Beauty cloaked in decay, faith shadowed by corruption, and the convent of the Weeping Madonna became the mirror of both. In the weeks that followed, more than one villager swore to have seen pale figures near the chapel at dawn, moving among the tombstones, their habits stirring without wind. One fisherman, passing by with his lantern, claimed the statue's eyes gleamed red for a moment before returning to stone. Whether it was collective madness or divine message, none could say. But those who approached the chapel at night would later say they felt something reach out from within, not to harm, but to mourn. And somewhere in the records of Palermo's archdiocese, dated December 1864, there remains a note in Latin beside the convent's name: "Silentium imponita, nulla visitations ulterius." So silence is imposed. No further visitations permitted. What happened inside the chapel would remain sealed for decades. But the sobbing, it did not stop. When the archdiocese imposed silence on the convent, Sister Agata's world shrank to a cell no larger than a crypt. Her duties were reduced to tending the chapel candles and keeping records of offerings left by the faithful, mostly coins, rosaries, and handwritten pleas for healing. Yet every evening, as she passed the statue of the Madonna, she felt the same chill, the same weight behind her ribs, as though someone were watching from within the marble. The others had learned to ignore it. Sor Benedetta forbade discussion of the weeping, calling it a test of faith, but repression only deepened the fear. At night, when the candles burned low and the sea wind carried the scent of salt through the stone corridors, the sisters whispered their doubts. "What if the Virgin mourns for one of us?" One novice asked. Another shushed her quickly. To question holiness was dangerous, even in private. Then one morning, Sister Agata was found kneeling in the chapel before dawn, trembling, her rosary clenched so tightly that the beads cut her palms. When the others approached, she whispered, "She spoke to me." At first, the Mother Superior refused to hear more. But as days passed, Agata's health worsened, pale, sleepless, her eyes haunted. Finally, she was ordered to confess. Father Palermo, the same parish historian who had documented the strange events, was summoned to take her statement under the seal of confession. The transcript, preserved in the diocesan archive until 1912, reads like the ramblings of a tormented soul. But certain phrases stand out. "It was not weeping from heaven," Agata said, "but from below." The voice said her name was Lucia di Ferranti. Buried beneath the foundation, she said she was promised to God, but given instead to the abbot of Palermo for his pleasure. When she resisted, they sealed her alive in stone and called it a statue. Father Cesar's handwriting grows uneven after this passage. He underlined the next words twice. "The tears are her blood remembering." He later noted in the margin, "Examine foundations beneath chapel. Possible relic or body interred." But no such inspection was ever permitted. The convent was placed under stricter isolation soon after. Sister Agata was confined to her quarters under the guise of illness. Yet those who saw her claimed her demeanor had changed. Calm, almost serene, as though she had unburdened something heavy, she took to humming old Sicilian lullabies that no one else recognized. When asked their meaning, she said, "It's what the Madonna sings when no one listens." Weeks later, the phenomenon in the chapel grew worse. The tears thickened, not clear water, but faintly pink, like diluted blood. The nuns wiped them daily, only to find them return by dusk. The smell of iron lingered faintly in the air. Father Cesar attempted one last intervention. In his journal he wrote, "The woman Agata insists that the weeping will cease when the truth beneath the stone is acknowledged." She names dates and places she could not possibly know. Something older than reason binds her. On the night of Epiphany, 1865, Sister Agata vanished. Her cell door was found open, the bed unmade, her rosary placed on the chapel steps. The sisters searched until dawn. Only one thing was discovered: a patch of disturbed earth beneath the altar, where the marble floor had cracked. It was said that Sor Benedetta forbade anyone to dig. "The Lord buries what must remain unseen," she told them. The floor was resealed with lime the next day. But after that night, the statue stopped crying. The air around the chapel became still again. The novices no longer heard sobs, nor footsteps, nor whispers. Only one reminder remained, a faint reddish streak forever embedded in the marble cheek of the Madonna. Impervious to scrubbing, resistant to time. Years later, a carpenter repairing the chapel's altar claimed to have found a human tooth embedded in the foundation stone. He told no one, except his wife. Palermo, as always, swallowed its secrets. When Father Palermo returned to the convent on the morning of February 4, 1865, the winter mist clung low over Sorrow's Hill. Palermo's streets below were already stirring with the noise of carriages and vendors. But up here the sound seemed swallowed by the air, muffled, as though the hill itself preferred silence. He arrived alone, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with his earlier reports, a set of consecrated oils, and an unsigned letter bearing the Archbishop's wax seal. Inside the convent, the air was thick with incense. Sor Benedetta met him in the vestibule, her face drawn and distant. She said little, only that the Madonna had ceased weeping since the disappearance of Sister Agatha. Yet her voice carried no relief. Something trembled beneath her composure, like a door rattling in wind. "I came to collect the records," Father Cesare said, "and to verify the cessation of the phenomenon." The Mother Superior hesitated before unlocking the chapel. The smell of lye and salt water met them immediately. The statue stood unchanged, the same serene face tilted downward, the same faint crimson stain near the cheek. But the floor, once bright, bore a dull patch where the lime had been laid. Father Cesare noticed it instantly. "You repaired this?" he asked. Sor Benedetta nodded, her rosary clicking faintly. The crack deepened. "We could not leave it open. It was dangerous for the novices." He said nothing. Yet later, in his private field notebook, the same one he kept beside his notes on the Palermo cholera epidemic of 1866, which he would later chronicle for the diocesan archives, he recorded something different. Surface resealed too swiftly. Earth beneath remains unsettled, lime still damp, the odor of decay faintly perceptible. As part of his inspection, he interviewed the remaining nuns. Most spoke reluctantly, answering in whispers even when alone with him. Sor Clarina, one of the younger sisters, told him that since Agatha's disappearance, she often woke to the sound of distant chanting. "It is like a choir," she said, "but sung through walls." Another, older nun insisted she saw a figure walking the cloister at night. A woman in a torn veil, kneeling near the statue, her hands red to the wrists. Father Cesare documented each testimony carefully. He was no stranger to superstition. He had studied the psychological toll of isolation on monastic life, even referencing cases from nearby monasteries in his earlier research. But this felt different. These women were not hysterical. They were frightened. Something had shifted in the convent's rhythm. He requested permission to perform a simple exorcism rite before the statue. Sor Benedetta hesitated, but eventually consented, on the condition that the novices be kept away. The ritual began at dusk. The sun slipped behind Monte Pellegrino, and the chapel was lit only by candlelight flickering across the marble Virgin. Father Cesare recited from the Ritual Romanum, his voice steady, though his hand trembled slightly when the wind blew through the shutters. At the moment he invoked the final benediction, a single drop of water fell from the statue's chin and landed on the open page of his prayer book. He froze. The candles hissed as though in answer. Sor Benedetta gasped and crossed herself, whispering, "Madonna di Dolori, Abbi Payet di Noi." Afterward, they both denied having seen the tear. But that night, Father Cesare wrote privately, "Impossible to deny what I saw. One tear, pale and cold as glass. Not illusion, not condensation. I fear the sealing of the floor was a grave sin, a refusal to unbury the truth." 3 weeks later, he fell ill. Colleagues at the Archdiocese described it as a wasting fever, though no cause was ever found. Before his death in late spring, he sent one final letter to the Bishop of Palermo, warning that something beneath Sorrow's Hill continues to breathe through stone. The convent's leadership changed soon after. The new prioress forbade all talk of the weeping Madonna. Records were locked away, the chapel restricted to clergy only. Yet among the townspeople, whispers persisted. They said that every Good Friday, a faint sob could be heard in the wind rising from the convent's direction, and those who climbed Sorrow's Hill claimed that the air there felt somehow heavy, as though morning never left. By 1870, most of the original sisters had either transferred or died. The name Madonna del Dolore was struck from parish ledgers, replaced by Santa Maria della Consolazione. But the people of Palermo still called it by the old name, the Chapel of the Weeping Virgin. By the spring of 1866, the convent atop Sorrow's Hill appeared to have returned to a fragile calm. The air of dread that once hung over its walls had faded into a dull routine of prayer, penance, and work. The younger novices had no memory of Sister Agata's disappearance or the months of terror that followed. But the older nuns, those who had seen the statue weep, who had smelled the iron in the air, carried the silence like a wound. When the cholera epidemic struck Palermo in 1866, much of the clergy's attention shifted to tending the sick and burying the dead. With Father Cesare gone and diocesan oversight scattered, the convent became largely self-governed. It was during this time that Brother Matteo, a mason and lay servant, was summoned to repair the chapel's crumbling steps. He worked alone for 3 days, chipping away at the old limestone beneath the altar's edge. On the 4th morning, while prying at a loosened tile near the center of the floor, his chisel struck something hollow. A faint sound, almost like a sigh, echoed beneath the stone. Startled, he dropped the tool. When he pressed his ear against the crack, the air rising from below was cool, damp, and faintly metallic. Matteo reported the discovery to Sor Benedetta, expecting instructions, but her response was immediate and severe. "You will seal it again," she said. "No one must disturb what lies beneath." Yet curiosity gnawed at him. That night, when the sisters retired, Matteo returned with a lantern. He pried at the loosened section of floor until a small square of earth gave way. Beneath it lay a cavity, narrow, but deep enough for his light to vanish into. The smell of mold and something older drifted upward. He lowered the lantern on a rope. Its glow revealed a wooden beam and what looked like fragments of cloth, half-rotted, pressed against stone. And there, just barely visible, the curve of a skull. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. The floor creaked under his knees. There was no mistaking it, the chapel's foundation hid a grave. By morning, Matteo's courage had evaporated. He confessed everything to Father Paolo Neri, a young curate stationed nearby. Father Neri, cautious but intrigued, agreed to accompany him to the site. Together they examined the hole, careful not to draw the sisters' attention. Inside the cavity, they found the remains of a woman, small in stature, wrapped in faded linen, her hands bound together with decayed rosary beads. No coffin, no markings, no relics of sainthood. Only the faint impression of pressure against the inner wall, as if the figure had been buried alive. Father Neri made a brief note in his journal. Female skeleton, likely 19th century. No official record of interment. Possible unblessed burial beneath consecrated ground. Violation of canon law. He sealed the floor again before dawn, fearing scandal. But his silence did not protect him. Within weeks, a fever swept through the convent. 3 sisters died, and 1 novice went mad, screaming that she saw a woman standing at the foot of her bed, her face pressed to the wall as if still buried. The convent's doctor, Dr. Lucio Farina, described the symptoms as hysterical contagion, a phenomenon not uncommon among cloistered women during epidemics. Yet in his private notes, later found among his effects, he added, "Every mirror in their cells was covered. They said her reflection appeared behind them, crying." The same word repeated, Lucia. When Father Neri attempted to bless the chapel, the candles refused to stay lit. The smoke from his censer drifted downward instead of rising, pooling around the patched section of floor like mist in a hollow. He closed his prayer book and left in silence. After that, the convent began to empty. Several sisters requested transfers to Palermo's other orders. Others took ill and never recovered. Sor Benedetta herself grew frail, unable to speak more than a whisper. In her final days, she was heard murmuring, "Forgive me, Lucia, I did not bury you. I preserved you." Her meaning was never explained. In 1871, a lightning strike damaged the convent's roof, causing a partial collapse of the chapel wall. The repair crew refused to continue work after finding what they claimed was blood seeping from the plaster. Near the Madonna's niche, local newspapers mentioned the damage but omitted the cause. The site was closed for nearly a year. When it reopened, the altar had been completely rebuilt, higher, reinforced with new marble, and with no visible sign of the old foundation. Yet those who attended Mass there whispered that the statue's expression had changed. The Virgin's eyes, once soft and sorrowful, now seemed faintly narrowed, not in grief, but in quiet accusation. And sometimes, when the organ played softly after dusk, parishioners claimed to hear another voice, faint, feminine, and weeping beneath the music. By 1872, the convent on Sorrow's Hill had become a place of uneasy quiet. The city below was stirring again after years of plague and political turmoil, but the hill remained curiously detached, as though the air itself refused to carry sound from its slopes. Only a few sisters remained, aging women whose eyes avoided the chapel doors, whose rosaries clicked with trembling fingers. When Archbishop Lorenzo Gigliardi ordered a diocesan review of all religious houses in the province, the convent was included almost as an afterthought. Inspectors were to confirm land ownership, confirm headcount, and verify that no unblessed relics or unrecorded burials existed on sacred ground. A growing concern following scandals elsewhere in Sicily, the task fell to Monsignor Pietro Valenti, a stern man in his 50s, known for his precision and lack of imagination. He arrived in March, carrying the diocesan seal and a letter of authorization. The nuns received him with formal respect, though their fear was barely concealed. Valenti began by reviewing the convent's written archives, ledgers of expenses, baptismal notes, property deeds, and correspondence dating back to the 1830s. Most entries were neat and proper, but when he reached the years between 1864 and 1866, several pages were missing. When asked, the prioress at the time, an elderly nun named Sor Adelaide, claimed that flood damage had destroyed some volumes during the previous winter, but Valenti found no water stains, only sections cleanly cut out. In one surviving ledger, he found a faint notation beside the year 1865, special containment measures ordered by Archdiocese. Weeping phenomenon suspended, body unconfirmed. All discussion prohibited. The handwriting matched that of the late Father Cesare Alemo. Beneath the note, in a different hand, someone had written faintly in Latin, "Tacit sub lapide." Let her be silent beneath the stone. Valenti pressed further. He requested access to the diocesan correspondence from that same year. 2 days later, a messenger from the Archbishop's office arrived with a wooden crate sealed in wax. The restricted files from Sorrow's Hill. When Valenti broke the seal, he found within the crate a stack of papers tied with linen string. Many were brittle, some half burned. The topmost letter bore the signature of Bishop Emilio Ventura, dated October 1865. The matter of the manifestation on Sorrow's Hill is to be suppressed. The faithful must not be encouraged in superstition. Any object, letter, or testimony referring to the weeping statue is to be destroyed, and all participants in the so-called visions confined or reassigned. The statue is to remain, but all traces of the event must be erased. Valenti felt a chill as he read. He was not a man given to mysticism, but he knew the Church's tone when it concealed scandal. That night, in the convent courtyard, he ordered the remaining records burned. The sisters gathered silently as a brazier was lit. One by one, the documents, letters, confessions, journal fragments, even Father Cesar's handwritten accounts, were fed into the flames. The air filled with the dry hiss of parchment curling, and the faint scent of wax and ink rising toward the stars. When the last document was thrown in, a single gust of wind passed through the courtyard, scattering ash like grey snow. Several nuns claimed to hear a sound, faint like a sigh from the chapel, but none dared look. Before dawn, Valenti left the convent. In his final inspection report, he wrote, "The matter is closed. The convent of Sorrows Hill remains sanctified ground. No heretical practices observed." But in his private diary, discovered after his death in 1881, he added a final line, "The flames gave no warmth. I felt watched as I burned," the words. In the months that followed, subtle changes returned. The statue, though unchanged in form, began to weep again. Not daily, but only on the anniversaries of deaths within the convent. The tears no longer appeared as water, but as a cloudy film, leaving faint white streaks down her marble cheeks. Locals began to climb the hill once more, leaving flowers at the chapel door, whispering prayers to La Madonna che piange nel silenzio, the Madonna who weeps in silence. By the end of that year, the church ordered the chapel closed to the public once more. The gates were locked, and the hill grew quiet again. Yet those who lived nearby swore that at night, when the wind blew from the direction of the sea, they could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone below the stone still sought to be heard. The story of the weeping Madonna might have ended there, buried beneath layers of silence and ash, if not for the arrival of a man named Dr. Ernesto Bellini, the newly appointed archivist for the Diocese of Palermo. A scholar by temperament and a skeptic by habit, Bellini was known for his devotion to cataloguing forgotten parish records. A task few envied, for it meant endless days spent in candlelight, reading the faded ink of dead men's confessions. In the summer of 1876, while reorganizing the diocesan basement, Bellini came across a sealed wooden chest marked only with the initials CA and the faded inscription, Convento del Dolore. Intrigued, he pried it open. Inside he found scraps of paper too brittle to lift, fragments of correspondences, ledger entries, and one small rosary wrapped in linen, still faintly stained. On a surviving half-page, a single sentence could still be read. "The tears are her blood remembering." Bellini's interest deepened, though most of the clergy dismissed the convent's legend as rural hysteria. He recognized the handwriting as belonging to Father Cesare Alemo, the same priest who had recorded Palermo's cholera epidemic only a decade earlier. To him, this made the story less of a myth and more of an unfiled investigation. He began collecting every trace he could find: parish reports, public notices, and forgotten letters. One clerk, reluctant to speak, finally admitted that certain documents from Sorrows Hill had been quietly removed from the official archives after the fire of 1872. They said it was to protect the church's dignity. The man whispered, "But we all knew something else was being buried." That autumn, Bellini obtained permission to visit the convent itself. The journey took him through olive groves and overgrown paths now half reclaimed by weeds. The gates of Sorrows Hill were rusted, the chapel door chained. Only one nun remained, an elderly caretaker named Sister Beatrice, nearly blind and scarcely able to walk. She lived in the adjoining cottage, tending to what remained of the gardens and the hens. When Bellini introduced himself, she smiled faintly and said, "You've come for the tears." Inside the chapel, dust lay thick on every surface. The air smelled faintly of wax and rain-soaked stone. The statue of the Madonna still stood at the altar, its marble face dim under years of grime, yet the faint red stain upon her cheek remained, stubborn as rust. Bellini approached it with reverence, tracing the edges of the mark with a gloved hand. "What happened here, sister?" he asked. The old woman sat in the pew behind him, her hands folded. "We were told never to speak of it. But you hear the weeping even now, don't you?" "Only those who doubt can hear it." He said nothing, though the silence in that chapel seemed thicker than any sound. Later that evening, while the storm gathered outside, Sister Beatrice allowed him to examine a small wooden chest hidden beneath her bed. Within it were 3 surviving items she had kept against orders, a torn journal page written in Latin, a lock of dark hair, and a chipped rosary bead. The page bore the signature of Sor Benedetta, the last Mother Superior before the convent's dissolution. "Forgive me, O Mother of Sorrows, for I have walled her in twice, once in stone, once in silence." Bellini copied the text and returned it to her keeping. He asked who referred to, but the nun only replied, "The one who still prays when we sleep." That night, Bellini stayed in Palermo's rectory, troubled by what he had read. His notes described strange occurrences. The smell of damp earth in his room, though no rain had entered. The sound of soft sobbing echoing through the corridors, though the building was empty. In the morning, he returned to the diocesan office and attempted to locate any record of a Lucia de Ferrante. The name that appeared in Sister Agata's old confession from 1864. He found nothing under that name in the baptismal registers, but in the parish death rolls of 1839, he discovered an entry, Lucia Ferranta, novice of Sorrows Hill Convent, cause of death unrecorded. The date matched precisely 25 years before the first reports of the statue's weeping. Bellini noted in his personal ledgers, "I begin to suspect the Madonna is not weeping for the living, but for the buried." When he returned to Sorrows Hill 1 week later, Sister Beatrice was gone. Her cottage was empty, the hearth cold. Only the door to the chapel stood open, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, Bellini found the statue unchanged, save for one small difference. The tears had returned, fresh, clear, and glistening down both marble cheeks, and beneath the altar, a hairline crack had opened again in the floor, through which the scent of earth and salt drifted faintly upward. By the start of 1877, Dr. Ernesto Bellini's obsession with the convent of Sorrows Hill had become an unspoken scandal in Palermo's clerical circles. The diocese grew uneasy with his persistence. Priests whispered that he was courting blasphemy by suggesting the Madonna's tears might not be divine but human. Yet Bellini pressed forward, armed with the precision of a historian and the fervor of a man haunted by unfinished truths. In February, he submitted an official request to the Archbishop's office, permission to excavate beneath the chapel of the Weeping Madonna. His justification was academic, to document early Christian relics and substructures of archaeological interest. But in private, his notes revealed his real intent. If a body lies beneath, she must be found. Her silence is the wound. Weeks passed before his request was approved. Reluctantly, and only under supervision, the church sent Monsignor Alberto Corsi, a cautious bureaucrat with little tolerance for folklore, to oversee the dig. Bellini, accompanied by 2 masons and a physician, began the work at dawn on April 9th. They started by removing the cracked stone tiles at the base of the altar. The first few feet revealed nothing but rubble and clay, yet as they dug deeper, the soil began to change color, darker, almost black, and thick with the smell of damp rot. At a depth of 5 feet, one of the mason's shovels struck wood. It was not a coffin. It was a door, buried flat beneath the floor. The wooden panel was reinforced with rusted iron bands, its surface marked with faint inscriptions in Latin. Noli apparire ante diem judici, do not open before Judgment Day. Monsignor Corsi ordered the men to stop immediately, but Bellini, trembling with a mixture of fear and revelation, insisted on continuing. "This is not sacrilege," he argued. "This is confession." Corsi, visibly shaken, reluctantly allowed the door to be lifted. The hinges broke with a brittle snap, releasing a breath of air so cold and sweet it felt alive. Beneath it lay a narrow shaft descending into stone steps, damp, uneven, and leading into total darkness. They descended with lanterns. The air thickened, metallic and earthy. At the bottom, they found a small crypt, barely large enough for 5 people to stand. Its walls were lined with crude frescoes, half faded, a woman kneeling before a veiled figure, a bleeding heart encircled by thorns, and an open eye drawn in ash. At the crypt's center stood a sealed stone slab. Carved upon it were two names intertwined: Lucia Ferrante and Benedetta di Rossi. Monsignor Corsi turned pale. "That is forbidden," he muttered. "They could not have buried her here. No nun would share her tomb with." He didn't finish the sentence. Bellini knelt and placed his ear to the slab. "Listen," he whispered. For a long moment, there was only the sound of dripping water. Then, faintly, a sigh, so subtle that the lantern flames wavered, as if in answer. The masons fled the crypt. Bellini recorded in his journal that night, "It is not death that dwells below the Madonna, but remembrance. The weeping statue, the scent of earth, the unregistered name, all point to a covenant of silence sealed by guilt. I suspect the Mother Superior, Benedetta, walled Lucia alive, and in doing so, imprisoned her own soul beside her." When the excavation resumed the following morning, the slab was lifted under strict ecclesiastical observation. What they found confirmed every forbidden suspicion. Two skeletons lay beneath, entwined. One was smaller, likely Lucia's. The other, larger, wore the remnants of a silver crucifix. Between them was a single rosary with one missing bead. A faint residue, reddish and crystalline, coated the interior of the tomb. The physician identified it as iron oxide, dried blood. The moment the slab was removed, the statue above, still visible through the opening in the chapel floor, began to weep again. Witnesses described the tears as clear and abundant, dripping continuously for nearly 3 minutes, before stopping abruptly. Monsignor Corsi ordered the crypt resealed, and the incident documented only in confidential diocesan records. "No word of this is to leave the church," he declared. "This is not a miracle. It is a penance." Bellini disagreed. "Then let it be known," he said, "that holiness can rot when hidden." His defiance earned him suspension from his post and the confiscation of his notes. But a month later, a clerk discovered that several of Bellini's sketches, the copy of Sor Benedetta's confession, and one of the skeleton's rosary beads were missing from the archives. Bellini was never seen again. Years later, villagers claimed that on stormy nights, a man in a scholar's coat could be seen kneeling before the ruins of the convent of Sorrow's Hill, praying not for the dead, but for the truth to stay buried. The convent of Sorrow's Hill was abandoned 6 years after the excavation. Its once white facade, blackened by humidity and ivy, stood like a tomb above the city. The church had quietly purchased the surrounding land, sealing the chapel with iron gates and issuing an official statement that the structure was unsafe for visitation. But locals in Palermo knew the truth, or at least their own version of it. They called it La Casa del Pianto, the House of Weeping. Shepherds swore they could hear the faint sound of sobbing echoing down the valley at dusk. Some claimed to see candlelight flickering behind the chapel's cracked windows, long after the last nun had been buried or relocated. In the autumn of 1883, a series of strange trespass reports reached the Palermo Carabinieri. Children from nearby farms told of 2 women dressed in veils, seen walking hand in hand near the convent ruins at twilight. The constables dismissed it as childish fancy, until a field worker named Antonio Greco filed a sworn affidavit describing the same vision. Greco, a 42-year-old laborer known for his sobriety, claimed he had approached the chapel one evening after hearing a low chanting sound, like a funeral mass. What he saw through the broken archway chilled him to the bone. 2 sisters, kneeling before the statue of the Madonna, though the place had been sealed for years. One wept quietly, while the other placed her hands over the tears as if collecting them. When I called out, they turned their faces toward me, and I saw no eyes, only hollow sockets, bright with light. His report, filed with the district clerk Carlo Mandelli, was never made public, but a private note attached to the file read, "This is the third account this month. The witnesses speak consistently of weeping and light within the eyes. Possible copycat hysteria following Dr. Bellini's disappearance." Bellini's name had become an unspoken curse in academic circles. His research on the convent had been erased from university catalogues, but fragments survived. A few letters preserved by a colleague in Naples, where he had once lectured on psychological persistence in religious phenomena. In one of his last surviving notes, Bellini wrote, "They appear when guilt returns to the surface. The tears are not of stone, they are of memory liquefied." By 1883, Palermo was experiencing a revival of Catholic mysticism, with processions, relics, and miracle claims reported across Sicily. The Capuchin catacombs of Palermo, where mummified bodies of friars were publicly displayed, drew pilgrims and skeptics alike. In that context, the Church's silence on the Sorrows Hill affair seemed conspicuous. Even Professor Matteo Grimaldi, a respected historian and member of the Societe di Scienze Lettera e di Palermo, commented privately that the Madonna's tears are the city's unconfessed grief. The sorrow of women buried twice, once in life, once in secrecy. Meanwhile, rumors spread of trespassers entering the convent. Late in November, two French travelers, Étienne Morel and Claude Dupont, both amateur photographers, bribed a caretaker to open the gates. Their intention was to capture the legend of the Weeping Madonna for an illustrated magazine in Paris. Only one of them returned. Morel was found at dawn on the road to Misolmare, wandering barefoot, his clothes soaked in mud and rain. When questioned, he spoke little, but one phrase repeated in a trembling whisper. The tears were falling upward. Dupont's camera and glass plates were later found near the altar, shattered. In his leather notebook, stained and nearly illegible, the final entry read, "Under the Madonna's veil, something moves. Not stone, not shadow. It breathes." That night, a thunderstorm struck Palermo. The following morning, the convent's chapel roof had collapsed. Officials declared it unsafe and ordered it fully demolished. But laborers refused to approach it. One, identified as Marco Vassallo, claimed to hear, singing from the rubble, two voices, faint, yet pleading. The demolition was postponed indefinitely. By the end of 1883, Sorrows Hill had become overgrown once more. Grass covered the broken steps. Fig trees pushed through the courtyard, and the iron gate rusted shut. Yet the villagers of Sant'Erasmo still avoided the road that passed below it. They said that if you paused too long beneath the hill at dusk, you could hear a woman crying softly, not from sorrow, but from longing. A few older residents believed it was the spirit of Lucia Ferrante calling for forgiveness. Others said it was Benedetta's soul, condemned to relive her crime eternally. And somewhere between those whispers, the truth remained, like the faint sound of dripping water echoing under stone. By the winter of 1891, Sorrows Hill had become more myth than memory, a silent mound cloaked in brambles, where children dared each other to climb at dusk and lovers carved their initials into the chapel's blackened stones. The church had long withdrawn its claim to the land, and what remained of the convent had passed quietly into municipal hands. Yet no one dared rebuild. That December, the Palermo Gazette published a short article titled, "Isola del Crime," relic of the past to be cleared. The city council had voted to finally demolish the remaining structures to prevent injuries. Work was scheduled for the spring, but before the order could be carried out, Sorrows Hill burned. The fire began just after midnight on February 3rd. Witnesses in the lower quarter described an orange glow rising like dawn from the hill. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the ruins were already collapsing in on themselves. The blaze lasted nearly 4 hours, consuming what little wood remained in the roof beams and old pews. Miraculously, it did not spread to the nearby olive groves. The flames seemed confined to the chapel's perimeter, as if respecting an invisible boundary. When the ashes cooled, investigators found something extraordinary amid the debris. Hidden inside the charred remains of a confessional booth was a small iron coffer, blackened but intact. It bore the faint initials BDR, Benedetta di Rossi. Inside the coffer lay a bound ledger, wrapped in linen, its edges singed but the inner pages legible. The document, now preserved in the Archivio Storico Comunale di Palermo, contained 47 handwritten entries spanning 1862 to 1864. The handwriting matched that of a nun educated in Latin and French, likely Benedetta herself. The first entries appeared mundane inventory lists, prayer schedules, confessions from sisters concerning improper dreams, and pride of spirit. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. The last entries, written in trembling script, grew increasingly erratic. Lucia's laughter fills the corridors, even when she prays. I cannot silence it without silencing myself. The statue's eyes are damp again. We have washed them with holy water, yet the moisture returns. I fear the tears are not hers, but mine. They whisper of leaving. They cannot. The vow is eternal, sealed not with God but with blood. The final page bore no date, only a short passage written diagonally across the margin, as if in hasty. Forgive me, Mother, I have made of love a grave. That was the last line. The discovery reignited public fascination. Scholars and priests revisited the events of 1864, though few dared to speak of the excavation. Dr. Ernesto Bellini's disappearance was briefly mentioned in a single editorial, suggesting he may have perished in the same flames that now cleansed the convent's remains. But some noted that the fire seemed too deliberate, as if set by someone who knew precisely what to destroy and what to leave behind. Among the ashes, a single object had survived untouched, the marble statue of the Madonna. It had toppled during the fire but did not crack. The surface, however, was different, pitted and grey, as if weeping had finally ceased. When a city worker tried to move it, he reportedly cut his palm on a sharp fragment embedded in the stone. A tiny bead of glass fused into the surface. The man swore that it shimmered like a tear. Shortly after, the statue vanished. It was supposed to be delivered to the diocesan storeroom for safekeeping, but when officials arrived to retrieve it, only the pedestal remained. The crate prepared for transport had been emptied and neatly closed. The guard on duty that night claimed to have seen a wagon leaving before dawn, drawn by a single horse, heading toward the Monreale Road. No one was ever charged. By summer, grass had grown over the ruins. Only the stone foundations remained, faint outlines of corridors where voices once echoed. The people of Palermo began referring to it as Il Col del Perdono, the Hill of Forgiveness. Though few dared climb it, folklore evolved quickly. Some said that when the air was still, you could see faint blue smoke rise from the soil, not the smoke of fire, but of incense. Others whispered that the missing statue had reappeared in a private chapel north of Seafault. Its eyes said to be carved with such precision that, under candlelight, they glimmered wet. A traveling friar, Frate Leone, wrote in his diary in 1892, "The Madonna of Sorrows has walked again. I saw her in a church where no one prays. The sisters there do not speak, but their eyes are bright with mercy or madness. I cannot tell which." The church never confirmed his account. By the century's end, Sorrows Hill was marked on maps only as Torino Demeniale 47B, but locals knew better. They avoided it after sundown, whispering that the wind through the fig trees sounded like weeping, soft, resigned, and human. And in the archives of Palermo, the ledger of Benedetta di Rossi remains sealed under glass. The ink faded, the confession incomplete, the final words smudged as if by a single fallen tear. The legend of Sorrow's Hill might have faded into the haze of Sicilian folklore, if not for one quiet event that unfolded 34 years after the first tears were seen. It began not in Palermo, but nearly 100 kilometers to the northeast. In the seaside town of Cephal, known for its great Norman cathedral and its cliffside monastery, in April of 1898, a wandering pilgrim named Giovanni Vella arrived at the Abbazia di Santa Caterina, seeking bread and rest. The abbess granted him shelter for a night, and as he prayed in the small adjoining chapel, something caught his attention: a marble statue of the Madonna standing near the altar, veiled in blue silk. To any casual observer, it would have seemed ordinary, but Giovanni, a stonemason by trade, noticed something strange. The eyes. They were carved not from marble, but from fused glass, grayish with the faint shimmer of moisture. He later wrote in his journal, "The eyes were alive, as if they remembered the sea. No sculptor in Cephal ever made such a face." When Giovanni asked the sisters about its origin, the abbess replied curtly that it had been a donation from Palermo, gifted by a benefactor whose name she would not disclose. But the pilgrim's curiosity deepened. He had grown up in the outskirts of Palermo, and the stories of the weeping Madonna of Sorrow's Hill had haunted his childhood. Stories of forbidden vows, vanished nuns, and a scholar who disappeared seeking truth. The more he stared at the statue, the more he felt certain. The curve of the lips, the positioning of the hands, the faint hairline fracture running along the left cheek, all matched the old descriptions, published in the Giornale di Sicilia decades earlier. That night, Giovanni could not sleep. He claimed to hear the sound of slow, rhythmic dripping, though no water fell from the ceiling. When he approached the statue again by candlelight, he saw that the veil was damp. Beneath the hem, the marble base shimmered with moisture, like condensation on glass. The next morning, he confronted the abbess, Madre Elena del Porto, and asked directly whether this was the statue from Palermo. For a long while she said nothing. Then, in a low voice, she answered, "It came to us one night, in a cart drawn by a single horse. The man who brought it said only this: 'She must rest where women pray in silence.' We never saw him again." Her words matched the testimony of the missing guard from 1891, who had described a wagon leaving Sorrow's Hill before dawn. Giovanni insisted on reporting his findings to the local parish, but Madre Elena begged him to reconsider. "Let her stay," she said. "If she weeps, it is not for the dead, but for those still bound." Nevertheless, the rumor spread. Within a week, villagers began visiting the chapel, leaving flowers and coins at the statue's feet. Some swore that her expression changed subtly from day to day. Sorrow one morning, serenity the next. Others claimed that when they knelt and prayed for forgiveness, they could smell the faint fragrance of myrrh and wet earth. By May, the diocesan authorities arrived to investigate. Among them was Father Lorenzo Corsi, the nephew of the same Monsignor who had overseen the excavation in 1877. He compared old sketches from diocesan records to the statue in Cephal and confirmed the match. But he noted one disturbing difference. The statue's right hand was missing a finger. In its place was a small hollow cavity, roughly the size of a rosary bead. Inside that cavity, embedded in wax, was a tiny sphere of dried crimson, unmistakably the missing bead from the rosary found in the tomb beneath Sorrow's Hill. Father Corsi's report, preserved in the Vatican's private archives, contained a single annotation in the margin. "If this is the same Madonna, she carries within her not the sorrow of saints, but the blood of penitents." After his visit, the chapel was ordered closed to the public, but the nuns refused to comply. Madre Elena wrote to the bishop, "We will not turn away what heaven has returned to us. If she weeps, we will listen, In August of that year, a drought struck northern Sicily. The surrounding villages prayed for rain. It came unexpectedly. The night after a procession led by the Sisters of Santa Caterina, who carried the Madonna's statue through the town. The following morning, the streets of Sifal glistened with water, though not a single cloud had been seen over the sea. The newspapers called it La Pioggia della Madonna. The church called it coincidence. But among the sisters, whispers grew louder. They said that during the procession, the statue had grown heavy in their hands, as though someone else had taken hold from within. That same night, Giovanni Vella vanished from his lodging near the abbey. His few belongings were left behind, save for his notebook. On the final page, he had written, "I followed her eyes, and they led me back to the hill. She remembers where she was buried. No one ever saw him again." Months later, a fisherman claimed to have seen a man's silhouette standing on the old road leading to Sorrow's Hill, illuminated by moonlight. He said the figure held something glowing in his hands, like a single drop of light or a tear. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the mist. By 1902, nearly 40 years after the first tears fell from the statue, Sorrow's Hill was almost forgotten, a lonely mound overgrown with cypress and silence. The road that once led to the convent had become little more than a dirt trail used by shepherds and smugglers. Yet, beneath that stillness, something seemed to wait. When the Diocese of Palermo announced a plan to consecrate the ruins and build a small shrine in honor of reconciliation, many locals greeted the decision with relief. It was time, they said, to put an end to superstition, to transform the cursed hill into a place of peace. The plan was simple: a modest chapel, a new altar, and a reburial of any remains found during construction. Supervising the project was Father Lorenzo Corsi, the same priest who had investigated the Madonna's reappearance in Sifal. He was older now, careful and deeply cautious. His private correspondence with the Archbishop reveals unease beneath his obedience. "I fear we disturb what was never meant to be touched again. The land remembers sorrow like a wound that cannot close." Work began in April. The old foundations were cleared, exposing fragments of tile and bone, most of them crumbling at a touch. Yet what the workers uncovered next startled even the skeptics. Beneath the layer of earth near the altar's former base, they found a pattern of stones arranged in the shape of a heart, bound together with rusted iron nails. In the center lay a small metal cross, corroded but still gleaming faintly in sunlight. Father Corsi ordered the cross cleaned and brought to the diocesan study. Under magnification, faint letters appeared along its shaft: Lucia. The discovery renewed whispers among the townsfolk. Old women claimed that Lucia Ferrant had been buried twice, once in flesh, once in legend, and that disturbing her again would bring back the tears. Corsi dismissed such fears publicly, though in his diary he noted, "If sin was sealed here, it was sealed with love, and love once buried is not easily forgotten." On the eve of the planned consecration, a storm gathered over Palermo. The workers took shelter in nearby cottages, leaving the hill dark except for one oil lamp burning near the foundation cross. Around midnight, a shepherd passing below claimed to see light emanating from the ruins, a steady, bluish glow pulsing like breath. When the workers returned at dawn, they found the lamp extinguished, yet the cross glistened, as if freshly polished. A thin layer of moisture covered the stone floor, clear, not rainwater, for the sky had remained dry through the night. Father Corsi, alarmed, ordered a halt. He knelt by the stones, touching the damp surface, then looked toward the horizon where the convent's walls had once stood. "This," he murmured to his assistant, "is not a place of forgetting. It is a mouth that refuses to close." Later that morning, he ascended the hill alone, to recite the consecration prayer. Witnesses from the village below reported hearing the distant toll of a bell, though no bell existed there, followed by a long silence. When the workers climbed up to retrieve him, they found Corsic kneeling beside the cross, his prayer book open, the pages soaked. He was unharmed but pale, his lips trembling. When asked what had happened, he replied only, "She forgave her. I heard her say it." That evening, Palermo was shaken by a strange tremor, brief, like the aftershock of a sigh from deep within the earth. The next morning, the site of Sorrow's Hill was covered in dew, though the surrounding countryside was dry. The moisture lingered for days, refusing to evaporate even under the midday sun. In the weeks that followed, pilgrims began arriving once more. Word had spread that the hill had wept again. Some came to pray, others to confess, still others to touch the damp earth, said to carry traces of absolution. The church tried to contain the rumors, insisting that condensation from the ruins was being misinterpreted. But locals whispered of something else, that on certain nights, one could see two figures standing at the crest of the hill, veiled and still, gazing toward Palermo's distant lights. A young sacristan named Paolo Santi, who kept watch near the site, recorded in his notebook on the night of July 6th. "I saw them by moonlight. Two women, one with hands clasped, the other reaching as if to console. Their veils moved though no wind touched them. I dared not call out." By the end of summer, the church abandoned the consecration plan. The official reason was structural instability, but those who had been there knew better. Father Corsi resigned his post the following year, retreating to a small hermitage outside Trapani. He never spoke publicly of Sorrow's Hill again. In one of his last surviving letters, written in 1904, he left a single, cryptic line: "The Madonna no longer weeps, because she remembers everything." And with that, the hill was left to silence once more, an open wound beneath the Sicilian sky, where faith, love, and penitence had mingled into one eternal sorrow. The night after Father Anselmo's disappearance, the air in the convent thickened, with an almost metallic stillness. It was as if the very stones of Sorrow's Hill had absorbed too many secrets and were now struggling to contain them. Rain fell intermittently, beating softly against the chapel's broken windows, and every gust of wind carried the faint smell of wax, iron, and something else, something older, like the damp of forgotten tombs. Sister Benedetta could no longer tell where prayers ended and confessions began. She knelt before the altar, whispering fragments of psalms that faltered into gasps. Her rosary beads, once smooth and white, had turned rough in her hands, darkened by oil, ash, and years of clutching in terror. Behind her, the cracked statue of the Madonna leaned forward, its glass eyes half clouded, one tear still painted on its cheek. When Sister Agata entered, her candle trembling, Benedetta did not turn around. "Is it true?" Agata whispered. "That the priest's blood was found beneath the crypt?" Benedetta shivered. "No one is to speak of it." "But the smell?" Agata insisted, stepping closer. "It comes through the floorboards. They say it isn't only his blood, that the Madonna's eyes wept red this morning." For a moment, neither woman breathed. The wind scraped at the door, and somewhere beyond the cloister, a bell rang without being touched. Benedetta finally rose and faced her. "Enough," she said sharply. "The devil feeds on fear. We are the brides of Christ, not his scavengers." Yet her words carried no conviction. In the silence that followed, both heard the same sound, faint dripping, rhythmic, almost tender, coming from the chapel's rear wall. The sound that had begun after the earthquake weeks earlier. Together they approached the wall where the Madonna stood. The candlelight revealed streaks of dark moisture running from beneath the statue's pedestal. Agata, trembling, dipped a finger into it. "It's warm," she murmured, voice cracking. "And it smells of iron." Before Benedetta could stop her, Agata traced the sign of the cross on her own forehead with the red fluid. "Holy blood," she whispered. "A miracle." Benedetta slapped her hand away. "Don't speak that word," she hissed. "You don't understand what miracles cost." But already, the others had gathered at the doorway. Sister Lucia, Sister Marta, the younger novices, their faces pale and hollow in the flickering light. They watched the red stain glisten on Agata's brow, transfixed, and then one by one, they knelt. That night, they prayed for redemption until dawn. Some claimed they heard voices in the dripping, a chorus of unseen women chanting beneath the floor. Others swore the statue blinked, its painted tear thickening into a living droplet. When the sun rose, the crimson marks on the walls had deepened, as though the stone itself had begun to bleed. By midday, word had reached the bishop's envoy in Palermo. He ordered the convent sealed for investigation, yet no one dared enter. The last visitor, a mason sent to reinforce the crumbling crypt, had been found unconscious near the threshold, muttering about, hands moving in the dark, and faces pressed against the walls. Benedetta tried to rally the sisters, to restore prayer and reason, but even she felt her faith thinning. The nights grew longer. The candles refused to stay lit. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could hear what sounded like Father Anselmo's voice, echoing beneath the chapel, pleading softly in Latin. On the seventh night, she woke to find the corridor flooded ankle, deep with red water seeping from the chapel door. The sisters stood in silence, staring at it, some weeping, some laughing, some crossing themselves until their hands bled. "Perhaps," murmured Sister Agata, "this is not punishment, but cleansing." And from the shadows near the altar, something answered. A whisper like wind through a graveyard, shaping words she could not bear to hear. "The blood of the saints remembers everything." Benedetta fell to her knees, her scream swallowed by the storm outside. By 1908, Sorrow's Hill was a place more of rumor than reality. The convent had long been abandoned, ivy crept over the ruins, and the foundations were barely visible beneath the overgrowth. Yet, the story of the weeping Madonna had never died. Scholars, priests, and curious travelers whispered of the statue, of vanished nuns, and of Dr. Ernesto Bellini, whose fate remained unresolved. It was in this context that a young archivist, Alessandro Ferraro, was assigned to organize Palermo's diocesan records. Among the old ledgers and forgotten correspondence, he discovered a hidden compartment in the back of a filing cabinet. Inside lay 3 leather-bound journals, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a faded blue ribbon. Each bore the initials BDR, Benedetta di Rossi. Ferraro's hands shook as he opened the first journal. The entries were dated between 1862 and 1864, during the final years of the convent before its destruction by fire. Unlike the earlier ledger found in 1891, these writings were intensely personal, unfiltered by fear of church censure. Benedetta recorded not only the daily routines and prayer schedules, but also her private thoughts on Sister Lucia, Father Anselmo, and the statue itself. "She watches me even when I close my eyes. I cannot speak of her without trembling. Her tears are my confession, her silence my sentence." In one passage, she described the moment the first drop of living tear appeared on the Madonna's cheek. It began with a single bead, clear as dew, running down her marble face. I knelt, struck with awe. It was neither rain nor paint. I thought, then, that we might be witnesses to something greater than ourselves, yet infinitely darker. Ferraro noted that Benedetta frequently mentioned Father Anselmo, whose disappearance had been long attributed to natural causes. According to her account, he had discovered a hidden crypt beneath the altar, where the remains of a novice, presumably Lucia, were concealed. She wrote, The priest saw what must not be seen. He trembled before it, and then he was gone. The silence followed him. The second journal detailed the sisters' gradual psychological decline. Benedetta wrote of strange noises, shifting shadows, and cold draughts that carried the scent of damp earth. She described the sisters' nocturnal prayers turning frantic, their whispered confessions filled with terror rather than devotion. One entry chillingly recorded. Agata dipped her finger in the liquid and traced the sign of the cross on her own forehead. It burns still in my memory, and I cannot tell if it was mercy or madness. The third journal contained Benedetta's final reflections before the convent's dissolution. She confessed her fear of the statue, the Madonna of Sorrows, yet also admitted a sense of devotion she could not abandon. Most striking was a folded piece of paper tucked into the back cover. It bore a single, cryptic note in Latin, non solvitur lacrima, omnia memoria retenet. So the tear is not released, it retains all memory. Ferraro Cross referenced these entries with earlier documents, including Bellini's notes from 1876 and 1877. He realized that Benedetta's words corroborated Bellini's suspicions. The weeping was not miraculous, but a manifestation of memory, grief, and guilt preserved in the material form of the statue. What troubled him most was the journal's final page, a map of the convent grounds, with an X marking a spot near the old chapel foundation. A small annotation read, "Beneath the heart, all is not yet revealed." Ferraro felt a chill as he folded the journals carefully. Even decades after the events, the convent's secrets seemed alive, waiting for someone to uncover them. He locked the journals back in their compartment, yet could not shake the sense that the story was not yet finished, that Sorrow's Hill had more to reveal, and the weeping Madonna was still keeping her watch. Outside, the Sicilian wind rattled the shutters of the archive building. Ferraro paused and swore. He heard the faintest sound of dripping water, soft and deliberate, echoing from some distance. By 1912, Sorrow's Hill had become little more than a legend, whispered among Palermo's older residents. The convent's ruins were nearly invisible beneath overgrown brambles and creeping ivy. Travelers rarely passed the hill, and maps labeled it only as municipal land. Yet curiosity drew a few hikers each year, seeking the thrill of the abandoned chapel, or hoping for a glimpse of the so-called Weeping Madonna. One such visitor was Giuseppe Rinaldi, a 28-year-old schoolteacher from the outskirts of Palermo. An amateur naturalist and devout Catholic, Giuseppe had grown up hearing stories of the Weeping Madonna and the vanished nuns. On a crisp March morning, he set out alone, notebook and walking stick in hand, determined to record the flora of the hill while indulging a private fascination with the legend. The ascent was quiet, save for the occasional call of a nightingale and the rustling of dry leaves underfoot. The hill seemed alive, yet empty, the wind carrying an almost imperceptible chill, despite the morning sun. Giuseppe later wrote in his journal, "It is not the sight of ruins that unsettles, but the absence of them. The stones remember something that I cannot yet see." Reaching the chapel foundation, he noticed fragments of marble, partially buried. Among them lay a small piece of stone, oddly smooth and polished, unlike the crumbling remains of the wall. Giuseppe picked it up and felt a coldness that seemed to seep into his palm. He examined it closely and recognized the curve of a cheek and the faint streak of a tear, unmistakably the style described in the 1908 diocesan journals. Suddenly, the wind shifted. A faint dripping sound echoed through the clearing, though no cloud or water source was visible. Giuseppe froze, heart racing. The sound grew slightly louder, rhythmic, like the gentle fall of water onto stone. It seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath his feet. He descended carefully into a shallow depression near the chapel's altar base, where the soil had collapsed to reveal a narrow cavity. Giuseppe peered inside and, in the dim light, saw something that caused him to step back in shock. There were two faint impressions in the earth, one resembling a small, kneeling figure, the other larger, as if standing behind it. They were so precisely formed that he could swear they were sculpted recently, though the soil was ancient. The shapes, he later noted, were not alive, yet they breathed memory. Giuseppe reported that he spent nearly an hour observing the sight. By mid-morning, the dripping ceased. When he turned to leave, he saw a flicker of movement at the top of the hill. Two figures, veiled and silent, appeared for an instant in the sunlight before vanishing into the trees. He swore they were not shadows or figments, but the very nuns who had vanished decades earlier, returning briefly to the hill that had bound their fates. Later that evening, Giuseppe visited the municipal archives to compare his observations with surviving documents. He found references to the 1864 excavation, Benedetta di Rossi's journals, and the various reports of the statue's movement and tears. Every record confirmed one thing. Sorrow's Hill had never truly released its hold over those who had lived or died there. Though Giuseppe tried to convey his experience to friends and colleagues, few took him seriously. Locals, however, remembered his account for years, adding his testimony to the growing folklore surrounding the hill. Some swore that hikers who returned after his report claimed to hear the faint echo of dripping water, a soft, persistent reminder of the past. Giuseppe's journal ends abruptly, mid-sentence, and as I turned to descend the slope, I saw the eyes of the Madonna, wet with tears, watching. The final words are smudged, as if the ink had been exposed to moisture that was not entirely water. Even after his account circulated, Sorrow's Hill remained largely avoided. Children dared not play near it, shepherds crossed the valley to keep a distance, and travelers spoke in hushed tones of glimpses of moving veils or faint cries at dusk. The hill had become a living memory, echoing the tragedies of the past and refusing closure. By 1917, Sorrow's Hill had fully entered Palermo's shadowed folklore. The physical remains of the convent were minimal fragments of stone, broken tiles, and the occasional rusted iron nail poking through ivy. Yet the stories endured, whispered among villagers, carried by travelers, and occasionally recorded in private diaries. The hill seemed to breathe memory itself, neither alive nor dead, suspended in a perpetual twilight of recollection. The last recorded investigation came that spring, when Professor Matteo Grimaldi, the historian who had studied the Capuchin catacombs decades earlier, returned to Palermo to examine the remnants of the convent. Grimaldi, now in his 70s, was meticulous in his approach. He carried copies of Benedetta di Rossi's journals, diocesan reports, and the fragmented sketches of Dr. Ernesto Bellini. His aim was to compile a comprehensive account for a private scholarly volume, though he knew full well that the Church would not sanction its publication. Grimaldi walked the hill alone, careful to note the soil, the faint depressions of old foundations, and the solitary fig trees that had taken root in the chapel's courtyard. He recorded the faint, rhythmic dripping of water that local folklore insisted was the tears of the Madonna. To his trained eye, the pattern was inexplicable. The soil retained moisture, even under the Sicilian sun, as if the earth itself were weeping. "I am not a man given to superstition," Grimaldi wrote, "yet there is a persistence here that defies natural explanation. Something remembers, though what and why remains unknown." He spent the afternoon cataloguing fragments of tile and stone. Near what had been the altar, he discovered a tiny cavity in the foundation, previously unnoticed. Inside was a small iron clasp, rusted but intact. It matched descriptions from the 1891 ledger, a remnant of the statue's missing rosary bead. Grimaldi carefully documented it, but made a note in his journal. "The object itself is trivial, yet its presence suggests deliberate concealment. Someone wished for it to remain undiscovered until perhaps the world was ready to see. As dusk fell, Grimaldi paused at the crest of the hill. The wind carried the faintest sound of draping fabric, almost like two figures walking slowly among the ruins. The light from Palermo below cast long shadows, and for a brief moment he thought he saw veiled shapes kneeling near the altar site. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth, myrrh, and the metallic tang of old blood. He later noted in his journal, "I called out, but no reply came. Yet the sensation of presence remained, a weight pressing on memory itself. I cannot claim to have seen the sisters, yet something of their sorrow lingers here, palpable and unbroken." Grimaldi left the hill that evening with the iron clasp and his detailed notes. He never returned. His final entry, penned 2 months later, ends abruptly. Sorrow's hill does not release what it has held. One may document, record, and reflect, yet the hill remembers what we have forgotten. The tears they. The page is smudged and unfinished, leaving the sentence, like the case itself, unresolved. Over the following decades, travelers, shepherds, and even a few scholars continued to report soft cries. At twilight, the glimpse of veils among the ruins, and the faint shimmer of moisture on stone where no rain had fallen. The legend of the weeping Madonna remained an enduring mystery. The hill stands to this day, overgrown yet watched, a place where sorrow, devotion, and memory converge. No one fully understands the origin of the tears, the disappearance of the nuns, or the fate of the statue. Palermo's people learned to leave it be. Some say the Madonna's sorrow is eternal, echoing across the valley for those who venture too close. Others claim that the hill itself keeps vigil, a living memory, waiting for the next witness. And so the story ends, unresolved, lingering and silent, except for the faintest drip of water, the quietest whisper, or the fleeting shadow of a figure that vanishes into the Sicilian dusk.